Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, former intelligence officer and author Gina Bennett on reconceptualizing national security.
You've got pieces that go to the puzzle, pieces that don't go to the puzzle. If you get up from your seat and look at the puzzle from a quarter turn, your brain no longer sees whatever image it was starting to build up in its head. And you don't even maybe consciously realize that you are starting to, you have a hypothesis that has formed. And now the pieces have to fit into your hypothesis when in fact the pieces fit where the pieces fit. They don't necessarily fit into your hypothesis. And it really is just a metaphor. It's looking at national security from a parenting perspective. I don't think they're really that different, the model, the framework. Most of the world's security theory is realism. We go on, and it has been for over 100 years since World War I. But trying to understand why, why are we still adhering to this? Like, why do we think this?
Gina Bennett, welcome to Chatter.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
This has been how many decades in the making now? Like 30 years in the making, right?
At least, yeah.
Wow. So yeah, we did not meet when you first came to CIA, because I was not there yet. And I believe you came from INR at State, right?
That's right.
Yeah. But it was not long after. And I recall I was working on what we call a regional account that is doing country analysis. And you were in at the time, I believe it was still called the DCI's Counterterrorist Center.
That's correct.
Meaning it was an IC element. It was housed at CIA, and big chunk of the people working in it were CIA officers, but it was technically under the hat of the Director of Central Intelligence, not the CIA director, even though they were one position. So long way of explaining that I probably within weeks of starting came across your work because the region I was working on crossed over heavily with the work you were working on in the Counterterrorism Center, and got to know you pretty early before I came to CTC, which was in 2001 before September 11th. So I guess that's a little backstory there, but tell me why you got to INR in the first place, and how did the transition from there into CTC go?
Sure. And kudos to you for remembering it was the DCI Counterterrorist Center, because it has changed iterations or changed names quite a bit. Well, my path is so incredibly accidental. Sometimes when I have students ask me, what was your pathway into the CIA or into counterterrorism? And I tell them there's no way you're going to replicate this, and you don't even want to, but it was just all circumstantial in so many ways. I went to the University of Virginia, and when I graduated undergrad, I knew one thing, and that is that I didn't want to go back home. For some reason in the 1980s, that seemed like a failure. I don't know why. That's just how we were brought up. So I took the first job I could that got me to Washington, D.C., because throughout my 4 years at UVA, I was very interested in Middle East foreign policy, actually. And I was too naive and uneducated to know that you had to have a PhD to work at a think tank, which was my dream. So I was looking for internships, whatever I could find. And as it turned out, the Department of State back then had something they called externships. So it was a paid summer internship program. It's about 10 weeks. And it was a GS4, which made at that time $12,500 a year.
Wow, big bucks.
A lot of money. And I found myself at the Department of State within a week of graduating from school. And my job was to alphabetize and type. I was a clerk typist. I can still alphabetize to about the fifth letter in a word really fast. It's great when you're playing puzzles and stuff.
That skill is probably very, very useful in very, very limited circumstances.
Yeah, but when it is useful, it's like it's like being a pool shark. Nobody expects it,
Right. Were you in the main state building or in Annex?
No, I was in the main state.
How did you feel about that? I mean, it's an impressive location. You have if you have your office in the right place. I did when I was there for a year on a policy job. You're looking at the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. It's kind of a cool place to go straight out of college.
Yeah, well, I wasn't quite so lucky, but I was on the first corridor, and believe it or not, I was in the retirement division.
Oh,
Here I was, 21 years old, in the retirement division. So, but I did get to, because I was also a typist, and that, now let me tell you, that's a skill. Like being a fast typist, you never stop using that. I still use that today. And I had the opportunity to process the retirement for George Shultz, who was, of course, the Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan.
Wow.
So that was my first administration, was the Reagan administration.
And his post-retirement, if we can even call it that, from being Secretary of State has been so productive, so successful, a thought leader for decades, that it's all due to your efforts processing him out. So thank you on behalf of the grateful nation.
No. So, yeah, I mean, I was lucky in that after probably about 2 months, my externship was getting close to technically ending. Mm-hmm. And the head of the office, her name was Trudy, but I can't remember the rest of her name. But anyway, Trudy was former military, and I was terrified of her. But I didn't think she even noticed me. You know what I mean? Because I was just this little clerk filing away stuff. And she brought me into her office and she said, "Gina, you don't belong here," which is something I felt all the time with imposter syndrome. She's like, "No, you don't belong here. You belong in intelligence. I'm going to promote you to a GS5 and I want you to go get a job in intelligence." And I just sort of saluted and said, "Yes, ma'am." Go Trudy. And so that's what I did. I applied for a position in INR in their 24/7 watch office. Mm-hmm. Now, you know, the watch offices around the intelligence community, around the national security, you know, the cabinet, they're all pretty much the same. And they are not at all like they are on television. They're, you know, really, and especially back then, we're talking low tech. Mm-hmm. So I applied for a position as a terrorism watch officer. So essentially keeping your eye on developments in the world of terrorism and counterterrorism every 24 hours. You do 8-hour shifts, that sort of thing. I didn't get the job. But I was like, okay, well, I'll keep trying. And then a week later or so, the director of the watch called me and said, "Hey, the person that we gave the job to decided she didn't want it. So you were our number 2 pick." So there you have it. Wow. The glory of being the next in line and available. So you get to INR. INR has a storied history, and people from INR will often remind you of that history, that they really are the inheritors of the OSS, because OSS was disbanded at the end of World War II, and before CIA was created, a lot of the research functions were sent to INR. So they inherited the research and analysis functions of OSS, but it's much smaller than most people realize. It is in the Department of State, a great bureaucracy, and it is part of that, but it is nowhere near the size of the analytic cadre of a place like CIA, right? No, not at all. When I went from terrorism watch officer to terrorism analyst, I believe there were 4 of us and doing terrorism analysis. Mm-hmm. And one of those individuals was exclusively doing narco-terrorism because, you know, we're talking the 80s. It was a big deal. Mm-hmm. One was doing Iran and whatever Iran was doing in the world, and the other was doing Palestinians. So I had to rest. There you go. And that did lead to something that you have been cited for many, many times. So I know you don't like people patting you on the back, but you were the first analyst to write a significant, healthy, robust treatment back in 1993 about bin Laden and the threat that he was presenting and would be presenting, which of course set the stage for years and years and years of work. But that was while you were still at INR. How did that process and the experience after that lead you to the Counterterrorism Center? Yeah, well, you know, the document you're talking about that was cleared through the FOIA process, I think, by the 9/11 Commission. It wasn't really the first thing that I'd written, but I had a baby before it could get published, and then the first World Trade Center attack happened, and when I had 3 days of maternity leave, I had to update that after my 3 days were over. So anyway, what happened was, initially in those early days, coming across bin Laden, and really more importantly, what we call now foreign fighters leaving Afghanistan and going on to other places. And of course, the dissolution of the Soviet Union led to a lot of instability around the world, including places with large Muslim populations. And so you can imagine, as did happen, a number of the fighters who had been in Afghanistan decided to go to some of these other conflicts. And so because I had almost the whole world, I mean, I didn't have South America and I didn't have the Palestinians or Iran, but I covered this whole swath. And in INR, you can't cover anything very deeply.
Right.
But one thing you can do is notice patterns, see anomalies. And so that's what led me to, and also we talked a lot with foreign liaison at State Department. It was really easy to do, even though we were in intelligence. And so, hearing from a lot of those countries, even in 89 and 90, just as people are starting to leave after the Soviet troops leave, really getting a sense of all of this. So I had developed a kind of a patterns analysis of what we were seeing, specific places in the world that were kind of way stations for all of this. And so I actually started working for this counterterrorist center before I left INR, because I believe it was 94, 94. So the Counterterrorist Center at the time had what they called the Community Counterterrorism Board and the Interagency Intelligence Committee on Terrorism, which was essentially the NIO shop for terrorism, because there wasn't one for terror. There was no NIO for terrorism. So it was, again, a community-focused, very collaborative. We were, of course, a small community back then. But I started a working group under the auspices of the IICT and the Counterterrorism Community Board. So I was the leader of the working group, but it involved analysts and collectors from other parts of the intelligence community who were seeing small pieces of this problem in their area. And like myself, they were finding nobody was really paying attention or believing it. And so power of numbers, as a group, we started producing papers as a working group. And so it had the multiple seals on it, which is a big deal. Yeah. And that is how we really got started. And, CTC was asking me if I would come over, transition over and be an analyst there. But the problem was they didn't have such a technicality, but they didn't have home basing, until 1996.
Walk through what that means.
I'm going to, The Counterterrorist Center, when it was created in 1986, it was set up as the Counterterrorist Center, recognizing that the agency only had authorities to do but so much. And countering terrorism is a massive whole of government, whole of society undertaking, honestly. But to counter individual terrorists or terrorist plotting is a better scale and a set of expectations. But the problem is, at that point, the agency, the centers were places where people would go from inside the agency or outside the agency on rotation. You weren't a permanent staff member there. And so they weren't really building up long-term expertise in the centers at that time. That has completely changed now, in large part because of the success of, Counter-Narcotics Center, Counterintelligence Center, Counterterrorist Center. So then, in order for me to have left INR, where I was already doing this analysis and this, warning work and leading this interagency team, to go over to CIA, I would have to actually be home based in like the Middle East office or something, and near East, and then wait for 2 years there before I could rotate back into CTC. Yeah, and I didn't want to do that. So in 1996, when they finally got home basing, that's when I was able to do that. And I mean, I loved INR. This is not because I didn't like INR. It's because this issue was getting bigger and it needed resources, and it was so unusual because it was not government. Mm-hmm. It was not a state, and everywhere still coming out of the Cold War was set up to do state to state kind of monitoring, and non-state actors was not familiar yet.
Right. And of course, by the late 90s, I would say, 97, 98, things were different than in 92, 93 in terms of awareness of threat. Obviously, by then you'd have everything from the OPM Sang bombing in Saudi Arabia to in 98, the embassy bombings in East Africa. You'd, of course, had the World Trade Center back earlier, but very different environment. And I think most people know the story of, getting to 9/11 and the government's shift to focusing on terrorism first and foremost. But there's a personal side to this too. Obviously, everybody who worked on any angle of this has their own personal stories. But yours is quite remarkable because this whole time you were having children, and you were having children that seemed to be oddly timed.
I know.
To major terrorist events. I'm not accusing you of collaboration. I'm not saying that.
You wouldn't be the first one to.
Statistics only get you so far. It seems like almost, you had 3 or 4 children in a period of time where every one was linked either to a major attack or to the emergence of an attack. Did that creep you out at all? Were you thinking, I just need to stop reproducing at this point?
I'm thinking the terrorists need to stop, not me.
Well, okay, there's that. That's another way of looking at it, sure.
Yeah, I'll take the positive side. It was uncanny because, the first one was, of course, World Trade Center 93. The second one was Khobar Towers, actually. The third was Africa Embassy. The fourth was 9/11. And the fifth one was what happened in Fallujah. It was very much tied to that. So
okay.
I did have quite a few people say, you need to stop getting pregnant.
But I like your attitude, which is, no,
it's like, no,
why should I have to stop? It's the terrorists who are doing the real danger. So you just said, I'm just going to keep having children, but I'm also going to fight the terrorists and make them stop.
Yes, exactly.
Well played.
Well, the funny, this is terrible, but the funny thing is, every time I thought, I need to rotate out. I need to do something else other than counterterrorism. Mm-hmm. Another attack would occur. And so, you get that, we can't lose, we need you. They say that to everybody and they mean it. We kind of do need everybody when when you're in crisis mode, but at some point you have to be replaced. And I kept thinking, okay, I'm going to get out. I'm going to do a rotation, do something else. Maybe I'll like something else. Who knows? But I would always get pulled back in. I never really got out. I'd always be guilted to stay in. So my really only way of getting a break from terrorists was to have babies.
Wow.
Other than
there's a new incentive that most people don't appreciate.
I know.
It does.
I was actually
right.
I briefed Condoleezza Rice while I was in labor with my last one, so It was that close.
That's an exceptional performance award of a different kind, right? So, but that gets to this point of, we faced it in different jobs where you have the particular expertise that has been built up on a particular issue, and so you're seen as essential, and that can be for the whole assignment. But that can affect you every day when it's, 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night and something comes in and they said, well, Gina, you've got to stay, or David, you've got to come back in because you're the person who knows this the best. And that may be true in individual cases. It certainly was true in your case on several very important things. And even as a manager there, I did that with people who really had focused on a particular subtopic on an issue I was managing. And yet, there is something perverse about that, because if a situation happened where, let's say, you were in the hospital giving birth, or if somebody got hit by a bus, or if somebody had a disease and was incapacitated, you find a way to get the job done. There are other experts who can do the work, maybe not in the same way, maybe not as efficiently, but there's this myth of the superhero, that every analyst is a superhero on their sub account. And they should be willing to, pull the Clark Kent and tear off the suit and go into superhero mode, like on a daily basis if something comes in. And yet that's not healthy physically or psychologically. How did you manage that? Because you were at the middle of that as much as anyone I know for a period of many years.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And, how I managed it, how other people managed it, it's all going to be quite different, and how the agency as a learning institution, as a learning organization, managed it over the years has definitely improved greatly. But, for those of us like myself, when, 9/11 happened, I had already been working in counterterrorism for 13 years. So, you're starting from a deficit already of probably mental health to begin with. And so more than anything, even no matter how much the organization or institutionally they improve to try to monitor and facilitate ways of not burning out, it's still the people. It still comes down to those, your colleagues in the trenches with you, who know that, they know you need a break, and they're there for you 100%. I mean, you know that. And I, when I was pregnant with my fourth child during 9/11, I ended up going to the hospital in the middle of the night one night because I was concerned about that. And as it turned out, there was a problem and it needed to be addressed. And it had actually been, I guess, instigated by or provoked by my dehydration. Mm-hmm. So after that, when I went back to work, probably that day, actually, that same day, because this was December of 2001 at this point, and I had colleagues bring me a bottle of water almost every hour and force me to drink.
I have a big recollection of there was some plotting behind the scenes that we set up like a bucket brigade, and everybody had the job to make sure that you were monitored is the wrong word, but you were taken care of on an hourly basis.
I was being monitored. It's okay. Yeah. But, so it's really, leaning into your friends and letting them help you is really important. And because you in turn will do that for someone else, or maybe you're doing it at the same time that you're being helped. That's a huge part of it. I also had the good fortune of a lot of kids. And I know that sounds crazy, but the older ones step up. They help. Yeah. They were, I always say with my oldest one, like George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life, he was just born older. He was born really responsible, and he still is. So that was a big deal. The other thing was my husband was able to work a lot of hours from home. Mm-hmm. And, having a partner who is picking up more than 50% of the household duties is, of course, shouldn't be unheard of, but kind of was during that period of time. Mm-hmm. And so I consider myself really pretty lucky with all of that. I will say it does take a toll, though. I tell my students I'm a recovering stoic, because I think more than anything else, you build up a wall in order to get through the day. And when you do that for 30, 40 years, it's very difficult to dismantle that wall when you are anywhere else. It kind of comes with you. So when you come home, sometimes that wall can still be up, and it's very difficult. And I think that's the hardest part to navigate.
Let me ask you, I don't think we've ever talked about this explicitly before, but we both saw people who did burnout. And we won't name names, but we probably have overlapping sets of people that come to mind when I say that. But without calling out anyone individually, when you did see someone burn out, whether the psychological pressure of CT work, which is uniquely challenging, or just that dynamic overall in the bureaucracy and the feeling of you have to be doing this or you're letting people down. When you saw that happen, kind of what did you see in the environment around you? Did you see people stepping in, filling the gap? Did you see people kind of shaking their head and tisk-tisking because they were still doing it? What did you see that told you the good things and the bad things about humanity?
Yeah, no, that's a good question too. And first of all, I would say the most extreme and worst cases, I think I, like other people, were still shocked, didn't necessarily, I feel like sometimes the people who are going to, who end up in an extreme burnout, even to the point of taking their life, it's like you saw signs, but not big one, not things that were complete. It still comes as a shock to you. So I don't know what it is about someone who, might reach a point where they're really good at hiding it. So because I have to say, that really would rotate through my head. We're analysts, we're warning analysts. We connect the dots. So how did we miss the indicators of something so wrong?
Well,
so
I think
bad.
you pointed to it is we're bad at it with ourselves, not to mention others. Like, could somebody who, is pregnant and working hard get into such a state of dehydration she needs to go to the hospital? That's your mind is focused on something, and it's almost like you have blinders on.
Yeah. But then, in other cases, I think you're right. There's always the one or two personalities who think, well, I'm working just as hard and, just put up with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I think they're rare and not the norm. And if, for everyone else, I have been part of many a conspiratorial conversation of how can we take the pressure off of so-and-so, she's always having to write the PDB, or, how do we, so-and-so's son's birthday is next week. How do we get him a break? Things like that. And of course there were some folks who were dealing with serious health issues at home that they, were missing. And so I think, we're working the agency. We do a lot of conspiring and we do our best.
Right.
But I also feel like we had management then too, even on 9/11 with Patty, who was fierce when it came to protecting her people and getting them what we needed. Now, not that there were a lot of the resources that we needed available yet, but she voiced it and she stood up for us, and that helps. Even if she's not able to bring in somebody to help us manage our time or to help us say, no, I can't do that today. Knowing that she saw it and that she was worried about us. And Patty, told us from day one, she was not a nurturing kind of person. She's like, I'm not a touchy-feely person. Don't expect a hug from me. And I remember her speech and everybody was like, wow, that was brutally honest. But she was wrong. She really was a very nurturing, caring person inside. She just had a different way of showing it.
Yeah. And that helps, somewhere in the chain of command to have that perception of, I'm not fighting this without recognition. And more importantly, I'm not fighting this without somebody trying to support that and trying to get resources for that. That goes a long way. It doesn't obviously resolve the major issues that come up in most people's lives, I would say, whether it's personal health, whether it's the health of a child or a parent, whether it's just psychological pressure. Sometimes you need more than that, right? You need more than just the perception of somebody is getting resources for the unit. But I think we were lucky in that regard, at least in my experiences. And I know, individual mileage varies, but most of the offices, virtually all of the offices I worked in across my years inside, I had managers like that. I had someone, if not a direct supervisor, but somebody within a level or two above that who I would put in that top tier of managers. And that helps a lot during those crisis times. Yeah,
it really does. And I mean, I definitely have more managers than not who are like that. And even all the way up to the most senior levels. Yeah. I mean, George Tennant and Jamie Missick, they always made sure we were fed. And it's, when you're not getting home for days at a time, it really matters. I mean, there's only so many times you can eat pizza, but it does matter.
Yeah, that's true. Well, you did something that most people, you did many things that most people don't, but you did something else that most people don't, which is you consciously reflected back, even while you were still inside, you reflected back on your experiences, including the having and raising children while chasing No Kidding terrorists. And you wrote a book about it, National Security Mom. And that's been more than 10, 15 years now that the book's been out. But in it, you do something that is really rare, where it's not really a memoir. It's not really an analysis of hardcore national security issues through and through. It's not really a sociological study of personal interactions, but it's some kind of mix of those three. And it just makes it really interesting to look at national security from a broader perspective, to realize the human element that goes into every day of somebody showing up in an office and putting forth their best work when they're juggling life all around them, of which work is part. I hate the phrase work-life balance. I've always hated it. It's about life balance, and work is a part of it. But as soon as you equate work and life, you've already lost the battle. But National Security Mom, I think, does a really good job of bringing up these issues and prompting discussions that people can have about this. Why did you choose to write that book when so many others in your situation would have either never thought of it or never wanted to take the time to actually pursue it and get it done?
Well, first off, thank you for the compliment. I appreciate it. And it really is just a metaphor. It's looking at national security from a parenting perspective. I don't think they're really that different, the model, the framework. So I always hated work-life balance as well. And coming at it as the mother in this picture, so often I felt as if I was being measured by this negative yardstick, I would call it. At work, it was, what meeting wasn't I able to be at because I had to be somewhere else with one of my kids? And at home, it was, what game or what, performance did I miss because I had to be at work? And so it's constantly negative, negative, negative. So I hated that term. And I do remember, I think it was in 2005 or 6 or somewhere in there. I don't even remember now, but we had the Women's Council during Women's History Month held a panel discussion, and I was one of the people on the panel. And I guess they thought, well, she's in the counterterrorist center and she has 5 kids, so maybe she can tell us something about work-life balance. So I was on this work-life balance panel, and it was in preparing for that, because you know what? I always have felt that the hardest audiences are not presidents or national security advisors or secretaries of state and defense, blah, 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 blah. They're your colleagues.
Yeah, totally.
And so, here were almost entirely a room full of women who I know are working just as hard, if not harder than me. And I'm going to tell them how I've achieved work like that. It felt just so not me, because I don't like telling somebody how to live their life. I can barely live my own. And so I remember just thinking about, what am I going to say? How am I going to, I didn't have any great grand tips to offer. And so what I did was really more from the heart. I just said, you know what, in reflecting upon this task of speaking to you all today, I realized that what I do at work and what I do at home is the same thing. It's the exact same thing. And that's balance for me, because being able to understand that the task of providing security to my children, it's not just about safety. It's not just slapping a coat on them when it's cold or locking the front doors. It is also about teaching them self-worth and how to like ignore a bully. It's, helping them realize that whatever they believe in is okay for them to believe in, and it's okay if other people don't. That is security, because as I've often said, if we had to evacuate our house because the fire alarms went off and we had to watch our house burn down, as long as we were all out of there, we were still a family.
Right.
So the structure and the thing, are not the same thing as the family. And I felt like security was the same way. We do have safety. Obviously, we were very much in the process of national safety as opposed to national security, trying to protect people, borders, buildings, aircraft, arenas, et cetera, infrastructure from being attacked in any way, whether it was terrorism or, any other kind of way. But that doesn't make us the United States of America. Right. So it's also our belief in our democracy and how government works and the institutions and the ideals and tolerance, all of the things that make us Americans and make us the United States of America. Those are the same things, because we want them to endure just like we want our children to be able to endure without us, the parent. So that's really where the idea came from. And I was especially at the time wanting to make the conversation about security And terrorism, of course, was still very pressing because it wasn't that far off of 9/11 and accessible to people. I didn't want people to think it's some spooky thing behind, in the dark, in the covert world, or it's all about military defense. And unless you're doing that, you don't know what you're talking about. No, every single person on this, has been either a child at some point or parent or a sister, brother, whatever. You've been in a family, hopefully, at some point in your life, and you understand what I'm talking about here. So you have all the expertise you need to have to understand how to secure the United States.
Yeah. And I think that message resonated. I mean, I've talked with several people, former officers and some current officers at the time who were like, I'm glad somebody's saying this, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't know how much of that feedback you got while you were there. I think mostly there's this culture of silence where anybody writes anything. And because that was never the norm and the culture just doesn't seem to promote that, people just ignore that it happened and moved on. But those of us outside certainly talked about it, and people recognized what you were doing there. But you chose, or I don't know if you chose, but you didn't end up saying, wow, that experience was so much fun, I'm going to quit and write books. You kept working.
Yes.
But you ended up in a position where now I think still regularly you're teaching at Georgetown. And you do a lot of mentoring, working with organizations like Girls Security and others. So obviously a transition happened somewhere there where you thought, okay, now is a time when I can apply my talents and energy in a different way. What was that thought process like? How did you decide that the time was right to start expressing yourself professionally in different ways?
Well, my youngest was able to make a grilled cheese sandwich for herself, so I could go teach as an adjunct. That's really what it took.
That's a really good day.
Bruce Hoffman, who was the director of the Security Studies program at Georgetown, had been asking me for a while if I would come be an adjunct. And, I love teaching. I didn't teach as much as you did, but I did my fair share of curriculum development for the Kent School and teaching classes. Mm-hmm. And so I always enjoyed that. I always loved, it's not just passing on what you know and hoping people can build on that, but it's also hearing what their questions are. And that is always challenging. And that's learning for you as the teacher, which is always very exciting. But so I wanted to do it, but I had to literally had to wait until my youngest one could make a sandwich on her own. Because it was straight from work to school. And when I said yes to Bruce finally, and I thought he just wanted me to teach a terrorism course. Mm-hmm. And he's like, no, I want you to look at he's like, I teach terrorism. I don't need you to teach terrorism. I'm like, okay, fine.
That's pretty well covered.
Which is fine by me, because if I don't have to talk about them, that's great. But he asked me to look at the curriculum, and he said, well, what do you think is missing? And I said, well, you don't have an ethics and intelligence class. And he said, do we need an ethics and intelligence class?
That's the wrong question.
I think he was joking, but at any rate, so that's what I did. I had been working with someone at the Kent School to redevelop our ethics course based on the ethics course that I had, the advanced ethics course that I took while I was at the Marine Corps War College. Mm-hmm. And just felt like we needed something that was more how to apply practical ethics as part of your decision-making process. Yep. And so that's what I created for Georgetown, and started teaching there in, I think it was 2016. I'm not sure now. I've had just extraordinary students. And, from there, I developed another course after that. But it's, I guess it was just something that I felt was not only going to help challenge me, because, you get expertise bias. Yeah. And you get to that point where if you start hearing yourself saying, oh, well, no, don't worry about that. That's not going to matter. That's whatever. And, oh, yeah, no, we've seen that before. Don't worry about that. That's not going to, or, oh, yeah, we've seen this before. We got to get on top of this. It's, when you start saying that, when you start caveating like that, you realize, maybe I need to be challenged a little bit, because, I remember when I was saying things like that when I was 21. Are you seeing this? This is weird. People saying, oh, it doesn't matter. Don't worry about that.
There you go.
Okay, that turned out to be wrong. So I never wanted to be that kind of expert, and having really smart, motivated students as well as colleagues challenge you is just good for you.
Yeah, you mentioned 2 courses there. So ethics, that's an interesting one. Having taught ethics to working level officers and managers for years, people in the business talking about the ethical dilemmas they face is one thing. But talking to college students about the ethical dilemmas of the profession that they're not in yet is a different kind of challenge. And I don't want to minimize that. Yeah. But you mentioned a second course, and this one is completely fascinating to me because I think I know what you're referring to. Are you referring to the hunter-gatherer national security course?
Yes.
Okay. Talk through your main thesis of this course, the backstory to why you had a fundamentally different way of looking at security and, if I can say, quite effectively writing and teaching about it.
Thank you. Sure. I mean, really, for me, I felt like something was off with the default concept of national security, even as a kid, because I grew up in the largest naval base in the world, down in Norfolk, Virginia Beach. My father was in the Navy. And so, we used to do duck and cover drills during the Cold War. And I always thought that was crazy. But, if we were going to get a nuclear missile in Virginia Beach, it wasn't really my desk wasn't going to protect me much. But at any rate, just the fear, the tremendous fear of mutually assured destruction, Soviet Union conquering the United States, defeating democracy, all of that. It was so bizarre to me because while I could understand that we might be physically damaged, I didn't think Americans would just roll over and say, okay, yeah, we'll be communists now. Thanks so much. We'll give up. No, I mean, we would keep fighting back and fighting back and fighting back. So I guess when I got into the national security profession, seeing how much priority we place on tangible security as the metric for national security just really surprised me from almost day one. Because, you stand there, I still have the Constitution that I swore my oath to some 30-some years ago. And the Constitution is not a building, It's a very hard, complex set of ideas and principles and adherence to a system of government that is incredibly complicated and almost deliberately, what am I trying to say? Gridlocking, it is deliberate in its intention to make sure there's no tyranny of the majority or tyranny of the minority. So that to me was security, like being able to keep that Constitution still applicable and alive and people loyal to it, whether we had buildings or not. So I think that idea was germinating for a really long time. And certainly when I wrote my National Security Mom book, it played up again. And as I began teaching and researching for ethics, I also began reading more and more anthropology. I really should have just gotten an anthropology degree, but I don't know where I would have squeezed that in with all the kids in the, Afghanistan, Iraq, all this stuff. So, but in reading anthropology and, trying to understand realism, all the realism security paradigms, because there's a bunch of them, as the foundation of really most of the world's security theory is realism. We go on, and it has been for over 100 years since World War I. But trying to understand why, why are we still adhering to this? Like, why do we think this? And at the same time as, the backdrop you're getting in the United States from 2015, 2016, 2017 onward is this sense of Americans no longer having faith in elections, in Congress, and even nowadays the Supreme Court or the justice system. And you're like, well, that's not feeling very secure in my mind. That to me, again, I'm equating my son has his heart broken by, his first love. I need to know that he's going to be okay. And he's going to, he realized that he's okay guy, that kind of like resilience is so important to me. It felt the same way in terms of our country was not being resilient at all. Yeah. At which point you sort of say, well, if after 9/11, if it doesn't really matter what kind of government we are, then we could have been a caliphate and we would still be secure. So it's got to matter, right?
Absolutely.
And I think with that as the real backdrop and me researching anthropology at the same time and a little bit of archaeology, it struck me, and this is where my thunderbolt, I guess, happened, but in learning about the Neolithic Revolution, when we became settled societies instead of nomadic hunter-gatherers, as hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years, depends on which scientists you listen to, but hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years, nomadic, everything that is happening to contribute to survival and well-being of that society, of your families, is all happening in the open. And let's face it, it's a lot of just surviving in the open. And when you're picking up and moving frequently to find new food, there's no permanent structures that you're building. There's no private space. There's no privacy really at all. So it's pretty easy to see all of the different contributions to societal survival and well-being. And they're not all the same. And it's not entirely gendered either. As archaeologists and anthropologists are increasingly finding, women were also big game hunters. So, and I'm sure men were also gatherers. The only thing that obviously could not be shared was pregnancy and childbirth. But that is a small part of your lifespan. So much more equitable, division of labor in everybody, even kids. Boy, if our kids today knew how hard children worked back then. But all of that happening out in the open. And it's really only when we discover farming and decide, oh, this is easier. Now we can just stay put and farm and make enough food for ourselves and have some influence over whether or not our crops live or die. You create now structures which then involve, bigger farms. So the bigger people protecting the farms. With the Middle Ages, you get very heavy farming equipment, the use of oxen, all of this requiring stronger bodies to really effectively do, which increasingly becomes men. This is where the gender comes in.
Yeah.
And then you have, since they're bearing the children and feeding the children, then they may as well just stay in the home. Now they get to be sheltered, which is great. Awesome. Keep the babies safer, keep yourself safer and warmer and all that. But all of the work that's happening inside this new primitive domicile, the innovation and the creation of fabrication of all kinds of textiles and containers, just a gazillion things. But that divide between what happens in the private space and what happens outside, I think unintentionally leads to this concept of public and private space. And because you have the hunter who is now the protector, defender of the farm, he also then gets the deed to the whole thing. He becomes the owner, the property owner of the farm, which includes the people in it.
Yeah.
So the women and the children.
And there's borders, and there's physical security trumping it. I think the aha moment for me when we talked about this, and then I read your work on it, is that the human experience up to that point, you're talking hundreds of thousands, millions of years, and experts will vary on the exact dates. But what we do know at a minimum is that the experience after that, the farming, the writing, the territoriality, the bifurcation of security into, physical and private stuff that happens that isn't public policy as much, that's less than 1% of human history. And you can argue that, well, that's where we are now. We are in a territorial farming, writing world. Okay, so those experiences do matter. But the written record, even going back to ancient wisdom, the ancient written wisdom is still covering less than 1% of human history.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that human experience and human evolution and human societal experiences, much, 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 much wider than what we think of as the combined received wisdom of the ages, which only goes back to really the beginning of systems of writing.
Mm-hmm.
That's the real aha is, okay, if you accept that human beings, weren't created when writing was created, okay, you have to get over that hump. But if you get over that hump, then you have to realize that there's a whole lot of experience and evolution that simply isn't captured by a very strictly territorial bifurcation of public and private space definition of security.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and again, I don't think anybody intended. There was no somebody said, "Oh, let's do it this way."
Yeah.
But as the public space became the domain of the hunter turned defender, protector, now we're talking trade. Trading all those surplus goods. That's where the writing comes in. I mean, eventually, that whole public space is where you find mythology, religion, science, math, all of these things start forming in that public space that we know because of cuneiform, symbolic writing, even before there were alphabetic writing. But what we don't have is anything nearly as expansive capturing what's happening in the private space, where mostly women, not exclusively again, but the gatherer turned caretaker turned, innovator, inventor, educator, and, strategic planner, all of that stuff happening in the private space is not being recorded.
Right.
And that is so hard for people to try to figure out, okay, well, if we're missing 50% of human ingenuity and lessons learned, how do we make it up? How do we capture that?
Right. And part of it, I would think, is just getting over the thought or the intellectual construct that, well, those were such simple times that we can't learn lessons from it. But as you've pointed out, to survive the wide range of threats across all aspects of existence, gatherers had to observe, collaborate, communicate observations, strategize to create unique solutions to new and different manifestations of threats, and then find a way to apply these solutions collaboratively to ensure the endurance of whatever polity there was. That's not simple, right? It's not the same as building tanks and missiles and coming up with strategies of deterrence. But one thing it's not is simple.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I mean, it's again, threats only occur in a context, they're not in a vacuum. And it's absolutely true. Many physical threats can be existential. They can destroy you, the individual on the wall, you, the family in the house, you, the city, the building, the World Trade Center, even you, the country like Ukraine is dealing with. But they won't destroy you, the person. Your legacy will live on, your influence in your own circles, whether it's family, children, grandchildren, or anything else. You, the nation, all of these things don't stop. They don't have to end with your existence being eliminated. So, there's a whole different side of security. That's why our Constitution includes the clause "and our posterity," because there's a recognition who we are today are not going to be around here, around 100 years from now, but we want all of this to live on and be available for the next generations. And yeah, I mean, it also, I think the other aha moment was this realizing that all of those lessons that occur inside the home occur in private space by the people who rule that domain, so to speak, is seen as irrelevant to what happens in the public. Whereas the public spaces where the laws are created and, the rules are made and the religions are, taught, and that's all relevant to the private space, but not the other way around.
And
it didn't used to be that way in hunter-gatherer times.
You're not exaggerating there. Was it Thucydides and some of these, ancient wisdom? They very explicitly said, the private spaces are frivolous and unimportant.
Right.
We need to focus. And as a security studies guy, I'm like, well, of course, that's what I chose to study on about that. That makes sense. But it really doesn't when you think about what makes a community a community. We are not the United States because of exactly where our borders are. Borders are a part of it. Buildings are a part of it. Of course, safety from foreign threats is a part of it. But that is not what security is. Security involves so much more, and we're not capturing it if we put these blinders on and look only at the traditional measures of hardcore military and national security.
Yeah. I mean, you have to look at it this way. By any measure, the United States, the people of the United States, our buildings, our infrastructure, our airspace is safer than any other place in the world. Mm-hmm. But yet, only 22% of Americans think that the elections are valid anymore. Yeah. Everybody hates Congress. Nobody even trusts the Supreme Court. People are questioning whether or not this president or the last president were actual presidents. What is that? Because all that great safety that we have is not securing the Constitution. It's not securing the unity of the American people. So a democracy requires that we tolerate each other and respect each other's differences. And we're not there. We are so far from all of that. I don't understand why people don't see that realism has failed us.
Yeah. How do you think this ties in, going back to our previous employment, 9/11, there was a conscious decision made by political leadership to say this was, and it was, a real threat, right? The loss of life was severe. And we are going to respond as a nation, and we're going to respond bigly, right? But we are going to respond in such a way that the U.S. military and law enforcement and national security apparatus handles it. The American people, society, we want you to go shopping. The idea is we don't want the economy to collapse. We don't want the terrorists to win. So go to the shopping malls, go watch your movies. We're going to get the metaphor was very visible with President Bush throwing out the pitch to the baseball game. We're going to continue on with life, and a small section of society will make huge sacrifices, particularly the small section of the U.S. public that is in the military or has direct family in the military, which is a smaller percentage than it used to be. But the rest of you, America, keep living your life as if it didn't happen, and that's how you contribute to the war. Now, there could have been a different strategy, which is kind of a more holistic view of security, which is, okay, this is all hands on deck, and it's not just going to be people who are in the military or in certain law enforcement or national security related areas, but we want every American to basically serve in one way or another, whether it is building up some civilian corps like in the Second World War, whether it is having community meetings about what makes us American and, turning up the civics education, which had dropped so dramatically in recent decades. Maybe it is, yes, everybody will take some economic hit, but we're going to use that to fortify our institutions of society and government just as much as we're, building tanks, bombs, and guns. That was a conscious decision, and I understand it. But I think it did, in a sense, reinforce some of the negative dynamics that you're alluding to here, that the overall perception of security was narrowed down to just, how many terrorists can we kill and can we prevent them from doing another 9/11, instead of what makes us resilient as a nation.
No, I agree. And I actually think President George W. Bush tried really hard initially to press the idea of engaging Americans in resilience and in resilient behaviors. The shopping piece might have hit the wrong note for a lot of people, but it was, I do believe he was on that thought path, but I don't think anyone else around him really was. And so we pressed on with, I think Cheney said, going on the dark side, and the war machine, and beyond just Al Qaeda to the Taliban, and then eventually Iraq. And we did the exact opposite when it comes to turning up the civics education, and I mean, it was all, it's so hard to blame people in the moment, because especially still a fairly new administration, and they got a late start, in 2001, and coming in, believing what they were inheriting was quite different from what they got. Right. I think wanting to go back to what they knew, which was still more the Cold War, state to state kind of paradigms. And this was a lot to get up to speed on.
Right.
And if you think in 1993, me standing up and saying Osama bin Laden is going to be a big terrorist leader, and people thinking, oh my God, she's nuts. In 2001, to say, hey, we need to be prepared for domestic terrorism, or white supremacy to come back, or any of these things, people would have thought we were nuts.
Yep.
And it is, now you can look back and see, I mean, we're taught to forecast, right? And you do that forecasting, and you remove yourself from the I'm an American, or this is about America, or this dot looks dangerously like my next door neighbor, or whatever. You remove that from your brain when you're thinking about it, and you just forecast. Yeah. Whereas, it's only in hindsight that people can look back and say, well, why didn't we think about this before? Like, how do we deal with terrorism, a terrorist act, and a terrorist? We can't make them all enemy combatants. Look, we're still arguing about KSM and Gitmo, and what are we going to do when you can't tell the difference between a foreign or an American actor because there's no attribution, in the digital domain, and it's really hard. Like, we just sort of tied ourselves up in knots by reacting to one form of terrorism, which was an aberration, in time, and creating so much structure around it, which is why our pendulum always has to go like this. And having come from the Cold War and watching that structure go this way, and then as I was leaving and the Cold War was coming back, I was like, man, I've seen this movie. I'm out of here. And it's going back again the other direction, at the pendulum. And I'm just like, when can we just find a way to accept that the world changes in waves, and we don't need to change everything with it?
Yeah. So,
the lack of having open, honest conversations with the American people and saying, just the logic, right? Just because we're attacked does not mean we're weak. Just because we're attacked doesn't mean we failed. Just because we're attacked doesn't mean we're losing. We are attacked because we matter, and if you want no terrorism whatsoever, then you only have a couple of choices. One, we could not matter at all in the world and nobody would care to attack us. Or two, you can just stop being afraid of it.
Yeah. And there's a message of hope and positivity in that. I mean, even in the wake of an attack, if you expand the definition of security and your conception of what it means to include, U.S. national character and commitments to each other at a personal and neighborhood and, of course, family level, then you find your national security is not really all that threatened by an attack. Yes, we want to prevent it. We have the means to prevent a whole lot of those. And I got to say, we did an amazing job collectively doing that after 9/11 with some very significant threats that in the alternate universes would have had 9/11 style and size attacks, and they were prevented. Okay, great. You do that. But national security itself isn't that threatened if you think about security as who we are rather than where's the border and what's the building.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Abraham Lincoln told us that, right? When he was 28 years old, the Lyceum address. if destruction be our lot, we ourselves must be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we live forever or die by suicide.
Okay, so you're saying there is some wisdom in the written word, even though Abraham Lincoln was not a hunter-gatherer.
Abraham Lincoln was a gatherer for sure.
Actually, you're right.
He was a caretaker because, I mean, that's exactly what he's saying. He's like, look, I don't, those armies, he said that. He's like, let the armies from Europe come over, and that's not going to matter. That's not going to destroy us. We are the only ones who have the power to destroy ourselves.
And it's interesting, I made a joke out of it, but I'm reflecting on it thinking I was exactly wrong. Like of almost all of the presidents, Abraham Lincoln grew up closer to a hunter-gatherer experience than almost anyone, not being born, into a wealthy family, not having, strong education other than self-reading mostly, literally hunting and gathering as a child. Mm-hmm. So maybe there's something to that. That's the addendum to your hunter-gatherer is the Abraham Lincoln as your beau ideal here.
Yeah.
What has the reaction been, whether at Georgetown, students, faculty, or people working in the national security community? Obviously, everyone's hardwired and the bureaucracy trains them to focus on, I'm only going to try to counter the threat from this kind of Russian missile, or I'm going to try to identify this Chinese technology. The whole bureaucracy isn't set up for people to suddenly take a step back and say, okay, I want this wider conception of security. But I think at a personal level, people get it. When you talk to people, it's hard not to see the benefits of thinking this way as a society. What has the reaction been when you talk about this? Well,
my students all love it. You have to self-select into this class because it's an elective, and so far they've loved the challenge. The alternative way of thinking about security. And for quite a few of them, almost all of them actually have commented about how, when they learn the fundamentals and they go through the foundations of security, national security, international security theories, which is sort of the first two foundational courses at Georgetown in that particular graduate program, they say, there was always something missing. There was always because they're looking at Thucydides, they're looking at Clausewitz, they're looking at, the realism paradigm, and they get to what we're talking about, and they're like, yeah, this is it. This is what was missing. So again, I don't teach it as a gender. It's not male, female, it's hunter-gatherer, because, today, there's no reason why men aren't gatherers, caretakers, or women aren't. I've been a hunter and a gatherer. I've done both sides. So, the younger students are quite supportive. Now, Georgetown as an institution is also very, very supportive. That's one of the reasons why I love Georgetown so much, is because they really do live their ethos of embracing challenge, new knowledge, alternative knowledge. They're not defensive or protective of their own way of thinking. And I appreciate that. I think that is something that I value, because that's the experience that I've had from the agency, where, your colleagues, you can fight tooth and nail over something, but it's intellectual. It's not an attack on each other. It's just, you take the thought out of your head, you put it on the table, and you let them wrestle, right? Yeah. But you don't connect it to the person. And so I really appreciate that about Georgetown. Now, security studies as a system, all the theorists out there forget about it. No, but I'm used to, I expected this. I expected this for two reasons. Number one, this is what I've always had to deal with. Nobody ever believes me. It takes like 20 years before anyone sees anything that I've said as being worthwhile or relevant. And number two, I'm a woman. And I would tell you that second part, absolutely. Because what they see is another feminist foreign policy or feminist international policy. And I disagree with that presentation of it, but I can't change people's minds or how they view things. But I have literally had men say, this is tangential. It has nothing to do with anything. This is not helpful. Like, oh my God.
Okay.
The fact
from one perspective, and I can't believe it. It sounds like I'm defending them, but from one perspective, they're absolutely right. The problem is, it is a perspective where that is definitional, right? If you say security studies is the study of, military strategy and doctrine and tactics, and it's about, borders, and it's about security defined that way, then by definition, you talking about this is tangential.
Right.
But they're not actually illuminating anything by making that comment. All they're doing is defining the walls that they've placed around themselves in looking at security. So that's not a helpful. Obviously, it's the wrong thing to say for other reasons, but it's not actually helpful in any way because it doesn't advance the conversation.
Right.
If you say it that way for that reason, you can't be wrong by definition because you're in an institution that has already defined it that way. Well, you're part of the problem then. That's the whole point.
I've tried to point that out too. It's like, okay, but this is the conceptual default definition of security at a nation state level because it's been decided that it is, but not because it is. There's a difference between something, having become the norm and actual reality. And I, again, as a woman, I explain, taking it to what most women experience, sexual assault or abuse or rape in their lifetime. And so, from our perspective, that is a violation of our borders, frankly. There are some states in this country that violate our borders and our right to privacy of our persons, just in not allowing, choice. Yeah. So we are used to having our borders violated left and right. We are used to violence left and right. We don't grow up with the expectation that we are going to be safe every single day. We don't ever. Not like from 4 on, you're not safe. So we don't feel insecure though. We feel unsafe. But the fact that any man I go rush up against anywhere in my day, and I don't mean physically brush up against any guy that I run into could actually be an assailant, right? Every single guy could be a threat. It's just like a gun, every single one of them could be a loaded gun. I don't know, but I don't go out in the world pretending like they're all a threat. And like, you know what I mean? And I'm not, I don't mean to disparage people who have real fears. And I'm just saying, so you acknowledge, like if women were allowed to walk around with like a fire breathing robot dog, right? Because we're afraid we're going to be attacked. And because we are going to be attacked statistically, we're far more likely to be, we would not think that's normal.
Right.
So if that's the case and you don't think that's normal, then you already have another definition of security in your head. You're just not willing to acknowledge it because you're expecting women to live a life of security being defined by resilience and their ability to adhere to their identity and our integrity. And we get to define all that stuff. And we are expected to survive the attacks. Then if we can do that, why can't the nation? We're the majority of the population here. So why can't the nation do it? You expect us to do it. You don't think twice about it. But, and, I try to explain it in this way. And, it depends. Some audiences are like, whoa, this is too much for me to think about, like too much to take on. Others kind of take it in and are, rethinking. And then you always have some people, both men and women, who are just like, now you're talking about stuff that has no relevance to anything. I'm like, God, this is 65 million women. It's
kind of missing the point.
It's not irrelevant.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And I can't help but think that there's a link here to, the whole security theater and the whole perceptions of security, which takes us in some different areas, but linking to the idea of, school shootings, we enhance security of the schools by arming teachers, which if you think about security as, feelings of well-being and overall health of students, faculty, staff, it's ridiculous. So it's a mentality that's not just, I think, easy for me to say, but it's not just about the woman side of what you discussed, but I think it's a wider societal feeling of looking for the traditional security solution when there are actually societal conversations that need to be had.
Yeah. It's the easier. I mean, as hard as it is, it's easier. It's a physical, tangible fix that is easier than the other stuff.
Yeah.
And when you think about it statistically, like how the percentage of teachers who engage in inappropriate behaviors with their students, now you're going to arm them? As opposed to the percentage of school shootings. And I'm not dismissing the intensity of school shootings, but do you really realize what you're doing?
Right. Yeah. Well, there are a couple of issues that I want to bring up, going back to the counterterrorism 9/11 days. And I don't want to miss the opportunity to get your take on a couple of things that have been on my mind in one way or another for almost 23 years now. The two popular conceptions, and I haven't done survey research, but my impression is that the two conceptions in the US population about 9/11 and the failure to predict and prevent it are, number one, failure of imagination, that phrase. Number two, failure to connect the dots. Two phrases that I think people sometimes say being thoughtful, trying to understand what they mean by it, but often they've just become bumper stickers, and people don't think through them. But I'd like to get your take on this. Like, to what extent, if to any extent, is it fair to talk about 9/11 as a failure of imagination first, and then we'll turn to the other one?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No. Obviously I disagree with the 9/11 Commission's, conclusions in that regard. And the reason on the imagination side is it's easy afterwards, after the picture has been painted, to take away the picture, look at the dots beneath it, and say, oh, well, you just couldn't imagine that was going to be a hijacking, of the aircraft. Or it's after, in hindsight, it's really easy to say that, to think that we weren't imagining this. As we are going into 9/11, watching understanding Al-Qaeda, its behavior, its patterns, Bin Laden, the threats,
no shortage of dots.
No shortage of noise. Lots and lots and lots of dots. And we used to have a saying years before 9/11 that, you give me the name of any famous person, singer, actor, celebrity of any kind, and a city anywhere in the world, and a big city anywhere in the world anyway, and a form of venue, a shopping mall, for example. And we can pull together the information that suggests there's going to be an attack against that person in that place, in that city.
That's right.
Because those dots
you
are
can
not
find the dots.
Yeah. They're so vague. It's not, it's, somebody's banana is going to land in somebody else's boat. I mean, it's like, it's not what people think it is. So if we used imagination, the number of plots that we could have come up with. In fact, we did before the millennium. We had that whole room full of on the wall. The walls were covered. It could have been anything in the world. It's not helpful. Structured analytic techniques, something I know you're familiar with, using structured research thinking, structured design thinking is, yes, very helpful. And that's what we do. But imagination is the wrong, and that's not the right answer, because we're going to be chasing things that are never going to happen. Yeah. So that's my problem with the lack of imagination.
Yeah, I think similarly about it, which is, I think it is a fair criticism, by the way, to say of any group that, is susceptible by management or psychology to groupthink of, are you being creative enough? And I think there is an analytic pitfall to, having hidden assumptions and going with the past analysis. And I think there is a role to spark people's natural creativity in a way that bureaucracies usually stifle. So I think there's something to the fact that people should be thinking both analytically and creatively. Mm-hmm. But in this case, the failure of imagination, no. I mean, you can point to intelligence documents that have been declassified that show, the month before September 11th, we were talking about hijacking of planes. Now, for different purposes, but, for freeing Omar Abdulrahman, not for, mass casualties. But if you turn that the other direction and you say, okay, failure of imagination, so we need to be more open to connecting dots, I'm with you. I don't know how that would stop. I mean, I would, and we did some of this, remember, after 9/11, when we were being asked questions like, okay, so what's the next target? Where else could people attack? It's like, well,
everywhere.
Yeah, you tell me I can come up with a valid reason why anything from, high rises in Chicago to a county fair in Iowa, to entertainment centers in LA, to Disney World, to schools, to bridges. Guess what? It doesn't stop. So failure of imagination sounds easy, but actually applying that in a way that's useful and sheds light instead of just blinding people is a lot harder. But you already mentioned dots as part of that, but talk about those dots, the fact that connecting the dots sounds good, and it brings us all back to childhood when we had a connect the dots picture where it told us usually in what order to connect the dots, and how that's different than counterterrorism or analysis in general.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you think about the metaphor, as I actually have taught a class in this. The metaphor, doesn't work on so many levels because those dots are not actual little circles with numbers on them to tell you the order to connect them, or and create this picture. But as I said before, they're just fragments of information, which you have to also expect at least half of it to be wrong, or even outright disinformation and lies. And they're always moving. And, they kind of come in view and they go and they fade and they go. So, go ahead and try to connect all that, because it's not going to be easy. And when you don't have any sense of the picture whatsoever, it could be a million things. You can only do this in hindsight. That's what irks us all about the criticism is it's only in hindsight. But in terms of, I think the real issue, though, the thing that comes out of the connect the dots conversation that I believe is still poorly explained in public is this idea that the CIA and the FBI were at odds with each other, or we're trying to one-upmanship, or we'll keep our stuff and we're not going to show you your stuff. All that stuff is also so damaging, because the Bureau had, its function was to investigate. It was a law enforcement organization. And the way it had done things was fine and working the way it had done things.
Right.
And that is, you investigate in the field office, the jurisdiction that you have legal authority over. And you're trying to run that case to a prosecution as tightly as possible. And the last thing you need to do is introduce squirrely, disinformation-laden intelligence, right? Yep. You don't really want. I mean, the walls created there are not because the people created them, because special agents and case officers or analysts hate each other. It's because they're there to protect the prosecution and to make it as clean as possible. And we know intelligence can be garbage. And so we know that, right? We understand it. But you're going to go in front of a judge and use a piece of intelligence in a case, and you're going to lose your case probably. I mean, especially back then when we didn't have as many judges who were cleared in to be able to read all this anyway. So there's a reason why what's happening in the field offices is happening in the field offices. It's not even going back to their own headquarters, let alone to the intelligence community. And it's not CIA's fault that we didn't have those dots. It's not FBI's fault that they didn't have those dots. It's the way the system worked then. Did you really want to break the system that was working then? So anyway, I just caution people about that. Same thing with the agency. Everything that we had was in one form or another shared with the Bureau. It's just no one knew no one knew what they were supposed to do with it, because at the time it's like, okay, well, that's information. Like, okay, maybe that's true. Maybe that's not true. Let's track this for a while. And, before we had the ODNI, who was allowed to share what information with whom wasn't clear. And, as you pointed out, the Counterterrorist Center was set up in 1986. And so we had Bureau colleagues in the Counterterrorist Center who had access to everything that everyone else had, including Midhar and his U.S. visa and everything else. They had that information.
That brings to my mind, and I don't recall who I heard this first from. It might have been John McLaughlin or Sue Gordon, but somebody much more experienced and wiser than I am, when asked to describe intelligence analysis, talked about putting together the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, but said, it's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, but you don't have the box, you don't have the image, so you don't know what you're trying to put them together. And you're missing most of the pieces of that puzzle. And you've got random pieces, and in some cases, many, many pieces from dozens of other puzzles that are thrown in. And to me, that kind of fits in with the connecting the dots, failure of imagination, jigsaw puzzle. Like, all of these metaphors get at something fundamental, which is trying to predict what other people are going to do is really hard. It's exceptionally hard when they're actively denying you collection and deceiving you about what they're going to do. And then you add in all of the foibles of human psychology and information processing. Guess what? It's a miracle that so many puzzles do get made, that so many dots do get connected, that so many times we do imagine things that could happen. But that's just me reflecting on it.
Yeah. No, the first person I've ever heard explain analysis that way was Cindy Storr.
Okay.
And, that's how...
It's old CTC days.
Because that's how it... And also she would say the pieces are moving because that's also how it feels.
Yeah, they're alive.
And, I used to use that analogy too, just in teaching analysis and also structured analytic techniques, because so much of the time what those structured analytic techniques are doing metaphorically is when you have been staring at the pieces of the puzzle that you have put together already, you're looking at them, and you have the pieces that are out there that you haven't been able to place yet. So you don't know what the picture is still. You've got, like you said, pieces that go to the puzzle, pieces that don't go to the puzzle. If you get up from your seat and turn a quarter turn and look at the puzzle from a quarter turn, your brain no longer sees whatever image it was starting to build up in its head. And you don't even maybe consciously realize that you are you have a hypothesis that has formed.
Yeah.
And now the pieces have to fit into your hypothesis, when in fact the pieces fit where the pieces fit. They don't necessarily fit into your hypothesis. So by changing how you look at it, and I think that's what the structured techniques, and most especially challenging your assumptions and using, or I should say leveraging other people to do it with you and help you, is so important. Because your brain works a lot faster than you think it does. And that's not always a good thing, but you have to have some way of seeing all the pieces in a new light in order to realize what you've been missing the whole time.
Right on. Well, at the end of each conversation we have here, we pull out our magical chatterbox and pull out a question. So for you, Gina.
Oh, boy.
Recommend any recent book you've read, podcast you've listened to, or TV show you've watched.
Oh, boy. It has to be or? I can't do all of those?
You know what?
Obviously.
You have earned the right. You have earned the right to do all of those, plus a play, plus a mime performance or interpretive dance, anything you want.
All of which won't be seen.
There you go. Good point.
Very smart.
But anything you recommend that you think people would get something out of?
I'm absolutely enjoying your podcast. As I said, I've been listening to them, especially before we met, and I have to say my first thought has been how fun to be able to reconnect with colleagues, because we tend to leave. We do our walk out of the building and we just leave it all behind. And it's not because we want to leave the people. It's because we want to leave the it,
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really nice. I can tell that that's fun, and
Yeah.
you can hear it in the exchange. Everybody feels really good about that connection, and you miss that. You do miss the people. As far as books, I'm actually writing one. So
Ooh.
yeah, so
I
right
feel
now
like we missed something important here. What are you working on?
I'm actually writing a historical fiction. So it's called If Two of Them Are Dead, and that comes from a Benjamin Franklin quote. But I'm bringing one of our former colleagues who was killed in a terrorist attack alive, bringing her back alive and turning her into a character who does some time travel. And she goes back to the Revolutionary War period and meets with Agent 355.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, I'm having a lot of fun with it. So.
I got to say, this has screenplay written all over it. It already sounds like this is a Netflix miniseries.
Well, it's just so fun to have two female spies who are 250 years apart, but they find they're doing exactly the same thing. And
great.
I like the juxtaposition of, one of them is fighting to create America, and the other one is like, oh my gosh, I'm not sure what you created is any good anymore. So anyway, that's fun. And then TV series, which TV series I really liked it's on BritBox, and it was Catch Me a Killer.
Okay.
And it's about the first serial killer profiler in South Africa in the 90s. And it's really extraordinarily well acted, but the writing, because it's the actual woman who was the profiler, it's from her book.
Oh, okay.
And I think it's anyone who's been in counterterrorism at a minimum is going to completely relate 1,000% to it.
Yeah.
And it is a really good reminder to, back to connecting the dots, how important psychologists are, cultural anthropologists, cultural psychologists, understanding just the way people on an individual level work, because there is a lot more predictability to it when you have that kind of expertise infused in what you're doing.
Yeah.
I was listening to your genealogy and genealogist Lisa.
With Lisa Maddox. Yeah.
Yeah. And when she was talking about the similarity of the tradecraft, I was just like, yeah. It reminded me, same thing I was thinking about with anthropology and psychology.
Right on. Well, I will ask one more question, which I already know you will hate because I hated getting it when I was writing books. But when do you expect to have it finished?
Well, I expect my portion of it, the first draft, to be done in the next month. I'm almost done, but
great.
From there, we'll see.
Then there are variables outside our control.
Absolutely. Just like every time you wrote a presidential daily brief, right?
Right. That's right. You may be the original author, but you are not the owner.
No way.
Sure. Gina, thanks for spending so much time with me chatting about these things. I think it was great and illuminating as well. I appreciate your perspective. If somebody wants to read more about the hunter-gatherer way of looking at national security, what's the best place they can go? Well,
aside from the Georgetown Security Studies Review article, there's that.
Okay. I'll provide a link to that in the show notes.
I have a link tree that includes all of my work, and media.
I will include a link to that as well. That makes things even easier. Gina, thanks so much.
You're welcome, of course. I enjoyed it. Thank you, David. It was so much fun.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.